Decouplers, welcome back. Today I'm joined by returning guest Michael Schellenberger. I think for our audience, Michael needs no introduction, but I'll owe you a few things here. Founder of Environmental Progress, best-selling author, Apocalypse Never, San Francisco. I think there's two more books in the pipeline. I'm not sure if I was supposed to say that out loud, Michael. We're going to be going a lot deeper into your biography because today we are here to celebrate saving Diablo Canyon. So Michael, a warm welcome
Woo!
back.
Thanks,
How
man.
you
Good to be
feeling,
back,
brother?
Chris.
How are you
I'm
feeling?
good. Last day of I just came out of COVID for my first round with COVID, and it was it's both worse and better than I expected. So I'm
Okay.
happy. Nice to end
Okay.
it with the saving Diablo at the as the final the final treat is coming out of COVID.
Well, you look like $1 million, and I actually didn't recognize you. I mean, I met you down in Berkeley in June, but this baby face, it's really worth our listeners jumping on YouTube to see this this time warped view of Michael. But I mean, maybe we are time warping a little bit because I think what I'm really interested in chatting with you about today is those early days. I used to do a bit of traditional martial arts, and we were big on sort of genealogy and scrolls of who came first and who passed down the knowledge. And I do think that's important in understanding as an advocate, as an activist, where you come from, whose tradition you are carrying forward. Obviously, we're putting our own spin on everything as we do that. But I in the attention that I put towards this, and I wish I had more time to do deeper study, but I see sort of early heterodox environmental thinkers like the dearly beloved and recently passed James Lovelock, who spoke a lot of truth to power when it came to nuclear. Stuart Brandt, but I think Michael, more than anyone I'm aware of, you turned it into a movement, which is very much what we're seeing now, and which was instrumental in saving Byron and Dresden, and I think Diablo Canyon here as well. So that baby face, maybe we'll be kind of time traveling, as I said, back to those earlier days. You sort of starting to see the world in the way that you see it, and particularly the early days of the Diablo Canyon movement. Um, so yeah, I'm not exactly sure where to start here. I'm giving you a few jumping in points, but again, let's just have like a bit more of a reaction to the significance of this news, which is I think only about 36 hours old right now.
It's a massive event. This is Diablo Canyon. This is a highly symbolic nuclear plant. It's my favorite nuclear plant. It's the first nuclear plant I tried to save. It's the most recent nuclear plant we've saved. We've now helped save nuclear plants in Illinois, New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, South Korea. Uh, we've helped got nuclear built in the Netherlands. These are all victories that we can take some amount of credit for. Of course, we'd never take full credit, and usually there's people on the ground there that deserve a lot of credit. But Diablo is a very, very sweet victory. And this is, you got to remember, it was the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who made shutting it down his sort of signature, act in order to run for governor in 2018. I started the movement to save it in 2016. It's now very mainstream. And at the time, I think it's worth pointing out, and I think it's part of the reason you were interested in having me on, we were very alone in that. It was a very controversial thing to try to save Diablo Canyon. I defended Diablo Canyon so vigorously on the local NPR affiliate in San Francisco in 2015 that they refused to have me back on. I've basically been blacklisted from a set of I was basically blacklisted from a lot of polite company for the last 6 years, and here we are today. I was quoted on NPR, the National Public Radio of the United States. I was in the Washington Post on this issue. CNN is flying me to Portugal later this month to speak about nuclear. This is I've gone from, I feel like I went from persona non grata to persona, most grata, if that's even a thing.
Celebrata.
Celebrata, nice. And I definitely feel like a proud father of this movement. I mean, I don't know if you're going to talk about it later, but you're on the front page of the Wall Street Journal today, or you're in a big Wall Street Journal story. You're a big
Yeah,
photo.
I got the
Uh,
online copy, so I'm not sure about
yeah, me
front
too.
pageness, but
But it's a
you know,
huge, beautiful story about the pro-nuclear movement. It opens with you, and it has all of the people that we all know in the movement. Zion Lights is in there, so I feel very proud of having been a co-founder of this movement, been a real early champion, in part because it was so lonely and painful in the beginning, and then to see so many people rushing into it. As they say, failure is an orphan and success has many fathers. And so I think we're seeing a lot of people taking credit for what's going on today, and that's fine. But I appreciate some of the recognition, because we were pretty much a small handful of us just a few years ago.
right, right. I mean, Maddie, formerly Szarwinski, now Maddie Hilly of Campaign for Green Nuclear Deal, she put this meme up yesterday. I'm probably gonna, paraphrase it incorrectly, but it was basically saying it's these, cool girls, valley girls in a car in a convertible, saying like, "Hey, loser, get in. We're saving nuclear power plants." And it just really spoke to me, and it speaks to that community. And we are, I think, a very welcoming community. Get your ass in here. We're having fun. But I think it also is like to have seen that, for that to be something that is permissive, or that could become a meme, I think would be very strange, as you're describing 6 years ago. Like who was there out there that was saying, "Hey, let's try and save quote unquote old nuclear plants." And I think that's really one of your key contributions, is that there's interest in nuclear. There's Bill Gates, there's other sort of tech entrepreneurs that are chasing novel designs. But in terms of this vision around stewarding what we have, around that being the foundation for the future, tell me a little bit more about that. Like I think some of us have kind of heard your origin story. We know you're involved in, I think it was the Apollo renewables kind of program. I don't want to kind of rehash stuff that's more on the public record, but I'm just interested in kind of laying that foundation as we dive deeper into the Diablo story.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I mean, I was an early advocate of renewables in the early 2000s. I co-founded something called the New Apollo Project. It pushed for a big government investment in renewables. Helped to personally lobby the Obama campaign team in 2007. They basically embraced the Apollo agenda. They did a huge investment in renewables. And it was around that time that I started to discover many of the problems with renewables that we're all very familiar with, not just the unreliability, but particularly the land use impacts. And we were seeing a lot of conservationists in California, in Massachusetts, start to oppose wind farms and solar farms because of the big impacts on wildlife. And I'm a lifelong conservationist. I care about birds and bats and desert tortoises. And so that really moved me. And it was around the same time that somebody said, "Why don't you take a second look at nuclear?" And I read the United Nations World Health Organization studies of Chernobyl, because that was an event that occurred when I was 14 years old and was terrifying for me. And I was I very quickly, on the one hand, I could look back and try to figure out how long did it take me to change my mind. On the one hand, it was a gradual process from 2005 to 2010. On the other hand, there was definitely a moment where, after I read the Chernobyl reports and realized how few people died, that I was like, "Oh, well, this is obviously what we should do." And then the question was, well, do we even need to do renewables? And of course, the correct answer is no, of course not. If you have nuclear, you don't need to do a bunch of solar panels and wind turbines. But then I was the co-founder of a think tank called Breakthrough Institute, and our donors were very liberal, and they didn't want us criticizing renewables. We co-authored this thing called the Eco-Modernist Manifesto in 2015, which argued for nuclear, among other technologies that are saving the environment. But there was no pro-nuclear movement at that time, and it became very clear to me that we needed one in order to save nuclear, that it couldn't be what nuclear has always been, which is an elitist activity. It's a place of pretty high snobbery if you really are a part of it. And eco-modernism had that snobbery, including the name of eco-modernism, which is not a name that
Mm.
I love. I find
Do you
it
have an
to
alternative name, or was
I
when
like
it was
I
being
like
crafted, was
pro
there a debate around what to call it?
Not really. It was only later that I
Okay.
realized it had such a snobby name. It had architectural connotations. I had some friends that were
Mm.
like, I love you, Michael, and I like the ideas, but the thing about eco modernism is that I don't like the word eco and I don't like the word modernism.
Love it. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I just, I at one point I think I was doing like a radio interview, like a quickie AM radio, and it was kind of like, what kind of environmentalist are you? And I was like, I'm a pro-human environmentalist. So I like pro-human
Right.
environmentalism. I also like pro-abundance environmentalism. I think that gets at it. Sometimes people say, "Oh, I'm pro-technology," but I mean, renewables advocates are pro-technology. They're just in favor of a different technology. So I think that pro-human gets added because I do think that much of anti-nuclear environmentalism stems from a kind of hatred of human civilization, of humankind. So, I mean, I think that my contribution, if I had to describe it in terms of creating this movement, was it's to create a movement is to de-snobify it. It's to make it popular rather than elitist. And that meant actually saving the nuclear plants that we have rather than, frankly, demonizing the plants that we have, which is much of what the eco modernist movement had been doing out of some, I think, kind of nihilistic celebration of nuclear plants that don't exist. So, you see a lot of people celebrating thorium. Oh, with these reactors, people say things like there are these reactors that don't melt down, they eat all their own waste and they run on thorium. And I'm like, yeah, in your mind they exist, but otherwise they don't exist. So to be a movement, I think it's important to be populist, to be anti-snob, pro people, and so that's what we did. And there were some tests of it right away. One of them was, they came. One of the tests right away was, you're dealing in a movement. You have to deal with people that you don't like, and you have to deal with people that are not necessarily your cup of tea. And there were people in the movement in those early days who were both much more apocalyptic about climate change than I was and or am. And there were people that were pro nuclear that were climate skeptics, which is not something I am either. And we actually had a discussion about it. We had various meetings. The other thing I did is that, in Europe, I knew that we needed to try to save the plants in Europe. So we went to Europe right away in 2016. The first meeting in Britain, nobody wanted to try to save the nuclear plants in Germany except for me and the Germans. Like nobody thought that it was worth trying to save the plants in Germany, but I felt
Just
it was
because
important.
just because they thought it was hopeless, or
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
this is something I'm interested in, right? Is like the psychology of your origin story, but the broader psychology of people who become nuclear advocates, right? Like there are some very interesting and particular things about our makeup. Like we tend to have a very thick skin, and we don't ever fucking give up. There's probably some more
That's right.
qualities there, and I'd be interested in your thoughts about them. But carry on telling the story. But I again interested in
Yeah.
those thoughts, and also, I mean, you're describing the movement as it was. I mean, we're still not numerous. We're still involved in this David and Goliath struggle, where we are sort of David with physics on our side versus Goliath. And you've done a lot to document just the sheer size of the renewables industrial complex or the NGO industrial complex around environmentalism. But sorry to interject, but just a couple things I wanted to throw in there.
Mm. Absolutely. Well, I think that that's right. I mean, that is a characteristic of a movement is that you don't give up, not until you succeed or until you win. In fact, one of the problems of movements is when they don't give up after they've already won. Not give up, but they keep making demands after they've already succeeded. We see that with a bunch of different movements. But yeah, so I mean, yeah, for sure you don't give up, but you also fight even when you know you might lose. You fight for things because you actually think that the process of fighting and building the movement is important in and of itself, that the movement is actually the end and not just the means. And that meant treating the people in the movement as ends and not means to an ends. And so that was a really core view that you treat everybody with respect and civility. You don't have to like everybody, you don't have to get along, but you do have to kind of have a sense of camaraderie, a sense of populism. So in Europe, so the first was like, we're going to fight for the plants in California, which also everybody had given up on, and the plants in Germany. Those are the two kind of most difficult countries, and in Japan,
Right.
okay, and South Korea. Like, in
This is
fact, I
like
kind
ground
of made
zero of
it.
anti-nuclearism.
Yeah. I kind of would make it a point
Yeah,
even almost it was really intuitively. I didn't have a good reason for it, but I was like, no, we're especially Germany. And I now look back and I think that the reason for that was because it adds tension. It actually and also it says something about what you're doing. It says exactly what I'm saying, which is that you're gonna fight for it even if you know you might lose, because in the fight there's something valiant and noble. Uh, and then of course we see we are going to win in Germany and California. So it actually ended up working out. But even if we had lost, it would still have been worth it. But I think the other issue that came up right away in Europe was that we had a set of folks, it was the climate alarmists, the most apocalyptic people who wanted to kick the skeptics out of the movement. They were like, literally, like, I think we should exclude climate deniers. And I was like, well, but are they pro-nuclear climate deniers? Well, yes, but we have to be 100% that climate change is the end of the world, and that's why we're saving nuclear. And I said, actually, if it's a pro-nuclear movement, it seems to me that you could actually have people that want to save nuclear for different reasons in the same movement, who might actually disagree to some extent about a variety of things, including climate change, but still support keeping the nuclear plants online. There was a lot of concern that the climate skeptics would undermine the credibility of our movement. And this is also behind some of the efforts to exclude me of recent years from the movement, or to try to, as you say, to write me out of the history. Has been this concern that there has to be a party line, and the party line is that climate change is an existential threat. Well, in fact, all of those efforts, in addition to sort of being morally wrong, in my view, because they are dehumanizing, they're suggesting that some people's views, that some pro-nuclear people are less valuable than others, and I think that's wrong on principle. But I also think it makes for a more fragile movement rather than a more robust one. A stronger movement would be one that welcomes people of all viewpoints, except for holding one, which is that we need a lot of nuclear power. If you can hold that, in other words, you're like, look, it's not a big movement to start with. So why are you trying to make it smaller? Why are you trying to be, and it's you kind of we wouldn't do it on race or gender or class or nationality. So then why do it with viewpoint? And it's interesting, of course, because this is occurring at a moment where there was a huge societal debate and cultural debate around the kind of demonization of people with different viewpoints, and of the need for viewpoint diversity in our universities and in the culture. So I made a very strong argument that we needed to keep people who were more climate skeptical, and I think it really paid off. And we see in Germany, one of our best allies is Bjorn Peters. He's in our WhatsApp group. Bjorn has become a friend of mine. Bjorn and we disagree about a lot. Like he wanted to argue with me about sunspots and climate change, and I was like, no, I'm like, I'm just not. I'm bored by that. It's like it's not even interesting to me. He's also super into a different kind of nuclear, this kind of dual fluid reactor. He's always trying to sell me on it. And I'm like, God, I love you to death, brother. But we agree that we need to keep Germany's nuclear plants open, and that is our North Star. And when we are focused on that, we are very powerful, and he is very powerful. So I think that says if that's hopefully answering your question. I think that was the ethos that I wanted to infuse the movement with, and I think it's stuck for the most part. Though there are certainly some people that are constantly trying to exclude people that don't adhere to a particular left wing view.
yeah, no, for sure. There's a certain element of that Monty Python. I think is the Life of Brian, right? The Judean People's Liberation Front and the People's Front for the Liberation of Judea, and they're at each other's throats constantly.
Yeah,
I certainly
yeah,
get that critique, because I'm a pragmatic person trying to make change in Canada, and I come from a pretty ultra left background. I maintain a lot of those core values and principles, but I'm absolutely willing to talk across the political aisle, and I've been very influenced by, I think, folks that you're referencing as well here, like Jonathan Haidt with the coddling of the American mind and his work on morality as well. Let's pivot. back to Diablo a little bit. You talked about, defining yourself as a pro-human environmentalist. Diablo Canyon had a major role within the environmental movement. We had pro-nuclear environmentalists, Ansel Adams, William Seery, and it sparked a real division within that. I think you'll do a much better job at describing that. But I first became aware of that, through your work. So I think that's a relevant part of the story as we kind of pivot and really bask in this Diablo victory. Let's paint the
Yeah.
history. Again, its significance. It's the feature, the logo of our podcast practically. I was really lamenting the day, if Diablo shut, I mean, obviously I'd keep it up there, but it's nice that it's going to live there and not be just a kind of museum piece. But yeah, tell us a bit more about Diablo Canyon's origin story and its impact on the environmental movement.
Yeah, sure. And I can even tell a little bit through my own, because of course everybody has their own Diablo story, but I mean, mine was, it was, okay, so it was PG. So I come out for nuclear and we start writing about it, probably around 2012. And then, of course, 2013 was Fukushima, and it was like, oh man, we really have to defend nuclear now. I mean, there was a wobble we all had, which was like maybe nuclear is as dangerous as they say. And then Fukushima happened. We're like, okay, it's exactly what we thought it was in terms of radiation impacts and public fears being much worse than the radiation impacts. You get to 2015, and PG&E and Exelon, by the way, both reached out to us at Breakthrough Institute and said, we've our plants are in trouble, and can you speak out for them? And I remember just being very like, instantly, I realized that it was important for somebody to defend these plants. PG&E then invited me to go and visit Diablo Canyon, and I was like, "Yeah, let's do it." And this was a plant, by the way. I should say, my one of my first memories of nuclear power was when I was a boy. It must have been around the 80s, like 84. My sister said to me, she goes, "Can you believe they built a nuclear plant on an earthquake fault?" And in my mind, I can still remember seeing a mushroom cloud because I thought that if a nuclear plant melted down, it was the same as a nuclear bomb going off in the mind of a young adolescent boy, And this was, of course, in the really scary period of the early 80s when there was this new fears of nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. I was a very apocalyptic kid. So yeah, they say come to see Diablo. So I was like, great, and I was like, look, I want to do the Diablo tour, but I want the nature tour as well. I want to see the outside of the plant, and so you get this incredible tour, and it's like it's just kind of classic Central Coast California, bucolic. There was an organic cattle farm right next door that was there that was marketing their beef. The outtake feeder, where the water leaves the plant. There's all these sea lions and seals. It was a spectacular natural environment, and you see nuclear for what it is, which is the most ecological form of energy production. I met the workers at the plant. We had lunch. I looked them in the eye. I said, "What happens if something goes wrong? What are you going to do?" And they're just like, "Look, we live here. We're going to fight to keep this plant safe." So you then get to 2016, or I realized then, we need to save nuclear, and that it was clear that I wasn't going to be able to do that at Breakthrough Institute for a variety of reasons, and I needed to start a new organization. So I started Environmental Progress to do that, and I just kept peeling that onion of Diablo Canyon, and then lo and behold, I discovered several books that had been written. The best of which is called Critical Masses: The History of Nuclear in the United States, where the author at the very beginning, he says, and the author, by the way, is now the official historian at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Wellock is his name. He says in the intro, he goes, "There's a typical story that gets told about nuclear that somehow it died under its own technical complexity or safety concerns." This is the famous Amory Lovins line, that nuclear died of, what was it, of its own attack of incurable market forces, or sort of this picture of nuclear as it's just too dangerous to be cost effective. And Wellock writes at the beginning of this book, he goes, "That's not at all what's going on here." He said, "What's really going on is the anti-nuclear movement turned the public against nuclear." And I remember reading it being like, okay, this really confirms my suspicions. And then he goes into this history, and you realize that the reason that we have Diablo Canyon is because of this guy, William Seary, the president of the Sierra Club, who was himself a Manhattan Project veteran, did these crazy, he was a UC Berkeley scientist, did these crazy, so he lived, a few blocks away from me in Berkeley, did these crazy high altitude studies on people's bodies, studied radiation, studied altitude, was this, kind of classic mid-century Sierra Club mountaineer, not this kind of wispy, woke Sierra Club people today that are kind of just a faint echo of the manly Sierra Club leaders of the past. I mean, these are the people that would like to get off work on Friday early, and then they drive up to the Sierras and they bag a couple of 14,000 footers and then get back home for work on Monday. And PG&E had come to him. They wanted to build the plant in some sand dunes in a place called the Nipono Dunes. Will Seary visits it and goes, "Nope, these dunes are too nice. We don't want the nuclear plant here. You got to stick it somewhere else." They discover this little canyon. They need to be near water, and that's so-called Diablo Canyon. And he pushes it through the board of directors of the Sierra Club, and the arguments against it at first just had nothing to do with the current arguments against nuclear. It all had to do with like, well, it's a nice, it's an oak woodlands, and then as they really started to turn against it, so he kind of gets it through, but everyone's sort of unhappy. And then basically from 66 to 69, that's when the anti-nuclear movement really forms. Diablo Canyon becomes a kind of case study, and you sort of see what happens, which is that these guys, they start to make arguments against nuclear that are Malthusian arguments against overpopulation, against too many people coming to California that would be enabled by cheap electrical power. And of course, so you suddenly are like, you realize the arguments they're making are the exact opposite the ones they would make later. The problem with nuclear is that the energy would be too cheap, that it would allow for too many people. And then they just you start to see these guys just start to make up all the arguments that they made up for the following, so it becomes a kind of, they start making up the arguments about radiation and meltdown risk and whatnot. But you can kind of see in Diablo is the kind of embryo, both of the ecological case for nuclear, right? You don't have to have coal mining, you don't have to have hydroelectric dams, which take up all the space, and the embryo of the arguments against nuclear. And so it really becomes the kind of case of nuclear. And so as soon as, like, the more you read about it, you're just like, I'm becoming, I think it's fair to say, obsessed with the plant, with the characters. Things would happen, like we would discover that PG&E had made a photograph of a humpback whale breaching in front of the plant, and we were like, what is this? We're like, this is the most iconic nuclear photograph ever taken. I mean, it's a stunning photo. I put it everywhere. Every chance to use it. You have a photo of it. I mean,
they of course probably weren't using it in their promotions, right? It took
no, they of course not.
Yeah.
No, of course.
Classic move, right?
Classic nuclear industry move, right? Where they're like, well, let's take a picture of the turbine hall. It's like, you have a picture of a humpback whale in front of your plant and you're not using it, you stupid engineers, So, yeah, so, there's that stuff. And then, so then suddenly I get word in 2016, people leak information, and they were like, they're going to announce they're going to close the plant. So I go down to San Luis Obispo, which is the city near the plant, and I hold a town hall meeting, and it is packed. I mean, it had something like 300 people there. And I was like, and of course I had this news about the plant being closed, and I basically got up and I just shared all the information I had, and I said, my promise is that I'm going to share with you, because I had some people, it was a weird reaction sometimes. Some people would like be mad at me that I was telling them that the plant was going to shut down, which is clearly just a kind of displacement.
Who's the audience, Michael? These 300 people.
It's a combination of workers and community folks, who had some concern over the plant.
Okay.
But it was at that meeting.
Just for international listeners, the context is this like a nuclear town that's just surrounding the plant, or it's a community with a bunch of other economic drivers?
No. Yeah. And have you been there, by the way?
I have not. No. Only. I mean, I've watched your footage of being in the boat in front of the plant, and I kind of feel like I've been there, and I've visited.
No. Yeah.
A
It's
few
so first
nuclear
of all,
plants around the
it's
world now, but yeah.
yeah. It's so first of all, it's an absolute. I mean, look, it's California. It's Central Coast. So people listening, they may know Big Sur is a very it's up the road. So Big Sur is up the road, Santa Cruz is up the road, and Santa Barbara is down the road on the south. But it's on the famous California Highway 1. It's this just really beautiful. There's a university, an engineering university in San Luis Obispo called Cal Poly, as in Cal Polytechnic. It's part of the UC system. It's a cute little town. I mean, it's not huge, but there's a cute downtown. It's a great place to raise your kids. It's not like a big city, but it's also not like, it's not podunk exactly either. I mean, there's a university there, and you wouldn't call it a company town at all. In fact, they made so much. The anti-nuclear folks were so successful there that they really turned the town against it, at least temporarily. I think the attitudes have shifted back and forth over the years, and now it's clearly on the side of keeping it open. So so I give this talk, and it's pretty well received, and I'm like, we got to build a movement to save the plant. And afterwards, up come these, or actually it was beforehand. Heather, then Heather Madison, now Heather Hoff, reaches out to me and gets in touch, and then she brings her friend Kristen Zaitz, and there are these two. I guess I don't know, is it sexist to say they're beautiful? I don't know. Is it bad now? Can I say that? I just did. There are these two beautiful young mothers, brilliant individuals, and passionate, and just kind of everything you'd want out of kind of movement leaders. And they were like, we want to help. And so they became Mothers for Nuclear, and now Mothers for Nuclear is its own thing, and they've got chapters around the world. There's so much that came out of it. I'll tell you another one. I love this photo so much too. Heather Hoff, she worked in the control room. So she was a control room operator, which, as you know, it's like the pilot of the ship, of the plane. It's a very manly little space. I actually saw it in Diablo when I got my tour. It was so cool. The men's that are operating,
It's like Star Trek,
men.
right?
It's like Star Trek, yeah. The control,
yeah.
But it was like analog Star Trek, right? So
Like
it's got some
Captain Kirk
steampunk
Star
in there.
Trek, we're talking.
Yeah, Captain Kirk. Yeah, exactly. Even with this kind of like 60s green, I mean, it was actually 80s, but the men are kind of walking around. It was mostly men, I think, but there's probably some, men and women are walking around, and but Heather, who now is a procedure, she writes up the procedures, which is also more interesting than it sounds. But she actually works in the control room. But she, one of the things that came out of 3 Mile Island, which of course was the best thing to ever happen to the nuclear industry because it made them get their shit together. They do tons and tons of worker trainings. So Heather took a selfie. Heather was taking a lot of selfies at the time, and she took a selfie of herself in the control room practice, like the practice control room. And so we've got this incredible photo, of that I've used all the time, of Heather, who's this, beautiful blonde woman in this control room. And I just think it's one of my most favorite photos of all of nuclear. I think it's iconic. And it also spoke to the ways in which my view was like, we've got to humanize the technology. We've got to feminize the technology. You've got to naturalize the technology. Meaning you got to let people see the technology in nature. And you've got to help people see that nuclear is people. People go, and so I would notice when I would go to my historical research, you go back and look at how the industry would present itself, and it would like show pictures of machines without anybody near them. And you still see this theme where you get these engineers who are bragging, I'm going to create nuclear plants that don't need any people, as though people are the problem. It's a real anti-humanism crept into the technology, but of course it's people, Yes, when something goes wrong, it's because of people, as always, like a jet plane. But when things go right, it's because of people. And so I wanted to affirm that human side of nuclear. And that also then meant working with the people that work in the plants, not being scared of them. Now, to some extent, you would see and which has been a huge challenge, and we can talk about it, but we would see sometimes workers and executives who have a lot of social fear, understandably, around advocating for nuclear, they would sort of hide behind the supposed lack of legitimacy to speak for their own industry by saying things like, well, Michael, it's good for you to speak out because you're not in the industry and we need third party validators. But I'm just going to stay comfortably at work and avoid any political advocacy. And I was like, and this was another change that I introduced, which was like, no, we want the workers to advocate for their plants. If the workers aren't advocating for their plants, you start to have questions about how good the plants are. So anyway, that I don't know if that helps to give some early picture of I think why Diablo Canyon then becomes a kind of symbolic and real world test case for what it takes to save a nuclear plant.
Tell us about the forces that came together to engineer the premature closure. Because I understand the union was involved or bought off,
Mm,
PG&E, environmental
mm.
groups, the governor. Like, what? Tell us about that story.
Oh, okay. Well, this is really weird. So okay. So it's really okay. So you have a set of anti-nuclear groups that have been trying to shut Diablo Canyon since 1969, right? So these
Right.
guys have been around forever. Mothers for Peace, Alliance for Nuclear Responsibility, NRDC, Sierra Club. Okay, so they've been out there operating. Gavin Newsom, who's lieutenant governor in 2014, 2015, 2016, is looking for things to establish him as a Democratic leader in the state and nationally. Friends of the Earth approaches him through a guy named David Freeman, who was actually the former head of the Tennessee Valley Authority. This is a very important thing because, of course, so much of the war on nuclear comes from within nuclear. So David Freeman approaches Gavin. This is sort of how the story was relayed to me by various sources. Gavin sees it as an opportunity. He pursues closing the plant, forcing the closure through the State Lands Commission, which he's the chair of as lieutenant governor, which is one of the agencies that has to give it one of the many permits that it needs. They then also go and manipulate the state water board to start to raise hackles about that tiny amount of warm water that enters the ocean and instantly becomes cold water because it's the ocean, claiming that there's some harm on sea life that nobody could possibly detect and of which there's zero evidence for. I discovered all sorts of weird things. I mean, it would take us too much time, but I mean, basically, I discovered, first that there was no science supporting any marine life impact from the plant, and that all of that was bogus. That this was all just being driven by Gavin's political ambitions. Then you get to the unions, and it dawned. So somebody, I'm like at the time, I'm just kind of calling people up and just talking to everybody. That's kind of how when I don't know what's going on, I turn on my reporter hat and I just call up people, and people talk. People talk at every level: government, unions, industry. And somebody said something like, the unions seems like should have an interest in trying to keep the plant open.
No shit. Yeah.
So I reached out to all the unions, and I know you've done work with unions, a lot of work, right? So I reached out to all the unions, and it became very clear that the most powerful union by far is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. So I reached out to the head of it, and I said, "Hey, don't you guys have a kind of fiduciary responsibility to protect the plant?" And boy, he was responding to me right away, because in other words, they have a legal responsibility to to fight for the plant. So he couldn't be in a situation where, he was having somebody like me accusing him of not defending the plant. At the same time, he was clearly involved in a political game with the governor, or with the lieutenant governor and the governor. And he was one of the slimiest individuals I've ever dealt with in my entire life. He's now moved on, but he basically he sent a guy over to meet with me. He offered me money. It was really weird. Like I didn't ask for any money. He offered me money, and I was kind of like, well, I'm always very suspicious when anybody offers you money. I mean, you should be. If somebody's like, let me give you money, it's like, why? Like, you have to be an idiot to be like, sure, just give me money. I was like, I mean, we certainly the cause needed it, but I was like, what are you doing? And they were okay. So it's just what I suspected. They had already cut a deal with Gavin, and they wanted to participate in shutting the plant down. They were negotiating to shut the plant down, but they had to look like they were trying to save the plant. So they go through a bogus plant saving exercise yard signs. They put this incompetent guy in charge of the effort. And here was the most sinister part of it. They literally ran ads in the newspaper to ask people to save the plant. And they were ads done by a professional. Anna Greenberg, I believe, was the person involved with this, a top Democratic Party operative, like nationally. They ran these ads, and I remember as soon as I saw them, I knew what they were doing. That the ads were actually like tobacco company ads aimed at kids, telling kids not to, it's like, remember the famous thing with tobacco industry ads was like the tobacco industry would be like, kids, smoking is an adult decision. Adults say don't smoke, and it was like the kids are like, great, I'll smoke. So these were ads, and they were so nasty that they actually had a woman turning her head away from the camera, and I think another one had her frowning. And it was like all this kind of garbled, terrible language. Like, it was the most off-putting ad, ostensibly to save the nuclear plant. It really sent chills up my spine when I saw them, because I thought, this is really sinister and cynical sort of behavior. So yeah, and then of course, as soon as Gavin more recently decided that he wanted to save the plants, IBEW was there turning out its workers to save the plants. You may have seen some of the videos of the workers just like, oh yeah, we're saving the plant now. So I've always had quite a jaundiced eye towards those workers, as have Mothers for Nuclear.
And I mean, uh, is it just kind of corruption that explains that? In terms of this fiduciary duty, we have a very different dynamic here. I think IBEW represents workers in a number of different fields. We're blessed in Canada with unions that largely represent just nuclear workers and are very clear about what that means and what that means politically. We don't need to dive
It's
into
known as
that,
a
but
company. They call it a company. Someone said that they go. I mean, the labor. I'm not a labor movement person, but somebody within the labor movement said this is known as a company union, meaning the company is basically controlled by the company. But that's not actually quite accurate. It was more like a political union. It was controlled by the Democratic Party. And I think a more judicious way, or maybe a more fair way to say it, is that IBEW is involved in multiple negotiations with PG&E and with the California government at any given point. And the status of Diablo Canyon is one of many different. The workers that it represents at Diablo Canyon are a small number of the workers it represents overall. It had a bunch of things that was negotiating at the time, including for like the guys that do the electrical, maintain the electrical wires, and that was like a big part of their dispute. But it was I mean, you got each of these things would look like separate rabbit holes that you
sure,
could
sure.
go down, and I would just kind of look at it and go, as IBW is not with us. Like, I knew that. So when I say we were very alone, I mean, we were really alone. I didn't have
Mhm.
the pro nuclear snobs that said they cared about nuclear, but actually would rather just talk about thorium and, frankly, bullshit designs that don't exist and never will. I didn't have the labor unions. I didn't have environmentalists. We were truly starting from scratch. And that was hard and lonely and painful. But I think that what it did is it allowed us to construct the ethos that I think has mostly succeeded, which is this ethos of having a value of building the movement and treating people like ends and not as means.
No, and I think that's something I've noticed. In terms of interacting with some of the prominent people in this movement, it's so much about someone reaches out, you give them a call, you get to know them, right? It's such a movement of personal relationships, and at times I've been like, hey guys, we need to be more savvy, with using. The web-based tools and sending letters with new apps and platforms. I'm not sure what the Justice Democrats were using, but there's been some sort of revolutions in political organizing in that regard. But what I've noticed in terms of the pro-nuclear advocacy community that's being really effective is that it's such a thing about cultivating people, getting to know them, and again, precisely that pro-human side of it, being very human focused. So you talked about, these kind of lonely years. So, I mean, obviously, quote unquote, the impossible has happened. This is quite a radical turnaround. I mean, 2016 to 2022 is quite a few years. Talking with my friend Isabel Bemeke, she was going around talking to all the different groups who wants to work on this Diablo Canyon thing. She was being told by just about everybody, it's a lost cause, it's hopeless, don't waste your energy. She came across, I think, Mark and Paris, folks that have worked with you at Environmental Progress, and and things have kind of moved from there. But still, I mean, I've been paying attention to this issue peripherally for some time, and I mean, this comes as a bit of a surprise to me. The legislature, I think it was four between the Senate and the House, four people voted against this legislation to continue operations at Diablo Canyon. Can you give us your sort of theory of change as to why this has occurred? I mean, it's occurring in a much broader context. We're seeing nuclear closure reversals around the world, but who would have thunk it in California?
I mean, it all it, I think it's really three things. The first is I do think we have changed opinions in California. There's objective survey evidence now that shows a plurality of Californians support keeping Diablo Canyon online. A minority opposes it. So that's changed. We've seen in other national surveys support for nuclear power has gone up in the United States, and I think that we can, as a movement, can take some credit for it, and I'll take some credit for it personally, given my TED talks and the work that I've done. So I do think that has had a big role. I think the second issue is that there's just reality on the ground, and that's that they can't keep the lights on here, dude. I mean, just to give a sense of it, August 24th, the state said that they were going to ban all gasoline powered vehicles in 2035. They're going to ban the sale of them in 2035. Well, 6 days later, they asked people not to charge their electric vehicles because they didn't have enough electricity. So I ran the math. You would need 10 Diablo Canyon sized nuclear plants to provide electricity for all of the EVs, if all the cars and trucks in California were EVs. That's, by the way, using the assumptions of California Energy Commission. So, what are you guys doing here? There's a kind of reality on the ground. The latest one I just pointed out is that they are firing back up a kerosene jet fuel powered power plant in Oakland, which is one of the dirtiest power plants in the state. It's been an environmental injustice and a blight on this Oakland neighborhood, a mostly poor black and brown neighborhood in Oakland. And they're having to keep running it because otherwise they're going to have blackouts. And so I guess that gets to the third issue, which is that, the governor had to do this. The governor, so you get to this incredibly symbolic thing where the governor who had demanded we shut it down is now saying you got to keep it open. He does not want blackouts either because, he's trying to run the state. He's trying to be a good governor, but he's also running for president, as I've been pointing out, including when I ran against him for governor a few months ago. People didn't believe me at the time, by the way. People said, "Oh, come on, Schellenberger." And he was like, "No, he's running for president." So I do think that politics can be your friend in that sense. But I just think, look, the Republicans in the legislature are pro-nuclear, just like Republicans in general are pro-nuclear. So that wasn't a hard lift. But the governor was just told the Democrats, "Look, you got to keep the plant operating, or we're going to have blackouts." And I think that few legislators wanted to be on the side of voting for blackouts.
There's a great friend of the podcast, Doomberg, who has this quote: "In the war between platitudes and physics, physics is undefeated." And I think there's kind of a strange irony here, which is, maybe it's renewables that saved Diablo Canyon, because of what an unmitigated disaster.
So failed.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Nigerification of California. I mean, I had Robert Bryce on a couple weeks ago, and he was just talking about Generac, and I mean, boom times for the diesel generator
Right.
folks out there in California and Texas in particular, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, that's sort of that's sort of the bottom line to it. But I do think because you can kind of go, oh well, did it matter what we did at all if it just takes a crisis? But I think it does matter. I mean, there's a famous quote from Milton Friedman, which is that you develop the ideas, and then it's going to take a crisis for the policymakers to finally pick them up. And I do think that that's what's been going on, and we have changed attitudes. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I mean, I can just tell you anecdotally. I would go onto Twitter in 2016 and people would accuse me of being a shill, of taking money from the nuclear industry, which of course I had not and never have and never will. They would say things to me like nuclear power is actually carbon intensive, which is just absurd. And now people express to me genuinely, particularly like Zoomers, or even young millennials, they kind of go, well, why are people against nuclear again? I don't even understand that. I just kind of laugh. It's like, well, it's a long story, but yeah, I think it's really changed. I just tweeted, some random person sent it to me, and I just tweeted it today, which was somebody tweeted, some young person tweeted, the fact that basically the entire world is in an energy crisis because a small group of people decided to be woke about nuclear energy is mind numbing, and it went viral. So I think that the people are starting to wake up to this and kind of go, oh, actually, there is no need for resource scarcity because nuclear provides infinite energy, fertilizer, fresh water, and food. It's a shocking thing to realize just what a miracle nuclear is.
Yeah, I mean, God, I'm blanking on the name of the guest just now. It'll come to me in a second, but Jonathan Campbell, I believe. So he was on and he was talking about Alexander the Great, marching through the Baku, essentially, where petroleum was just bubbling to the surface. But, he
Yeah.
had no petroleum distillery industry. He had no diesel engines. So, it was used, I guess, a little party fun, some Greek fire here and there, right? And it just strikes me. I mean, having a nuclear plant that's there operational paid off, you can turn magic rocks into just copious amounts of energy. I mean, I'm speaking a
Yeah.
truism here to someone who has no need to hear this stated again, but I mean, it is absolutely mind-boggling the kind of civilizational vandalism that we've been seeing with the closure of this key infrastructure. You've been talking a lot recently. We hung out briefly again in Berkeley. I have very academic parents. I really should have paid a lot more attention when they were talking about some of the greats, and it was very foolish rebellion of mine not to have read and picked their minds as much. But you've been sort of exploring nihilism recently, decivilization. I know you've been influenced a bit by Peter Zeihan's most recent book on deglobalization. So in the context of that sort of Alexander the Great comment there, and the sort of civilizational vandalism of destroying perfectly operational nuclear plants in a context where, I'm starting to think of things a little bit as there's almost like a war against nature that's starting, not in the typical way we think about it in terms of resource extraction, but like nature's maybe becoming a little less inhospitable. Throughout human history, most of human history, human beings have really, had to fight off the forces of nature. We've become very comfortable recently, but, having energy is both a key way to mitigate climate change, but also to adapt and to be able to deal with, for instance, the water crisis you're seeing in your home state right now. So, talk a little bit, I guess,
So it's a
about
question, right? Yeah.
yeah.
Why are we having an energy shortage? Why do we have a fresh water, an energy shortage if we have nuclear power? Why we have abundant energy? We have enough natural gas for over 1,000 years for the United States and Europe combined. We have nuclear is infinite. So why do we have these shortages? They're clearly, first of all, they're self-inflicted. We've decided not to do them. So then you get to the question of, well, why are we not doing it? And you kind of go, well, people were misinformed about nuclear, but then why were we misinformed about nuclear? What's going on? And you trace that down. You kind of go, well, there's financial interests that compete with nuclear. There's sort of, the competing industries, but that doesn't really explain why. I mean, newspapers didn't stop the rise of the internet. So why are they able to repress nuclear? And I think you come to basically it's people that are on a spiritual crusade that are trying to stop nuclear. I mean, like literally the Germans and Greenpeace, they've endorsed coal over nuclear because nuclear is the devil. It has taken the position archetypally and spiritually of a demonic force. Whereas coal might be polluting, but it's not demonic in the way that nuclear has become for spiritual, German apocalyptic environmentalists. It's a religion. So where does that come from? And it fundamentally comes out of the crisis of faith, of the move away from traditional religions that really starts intensifying in the late 19th century and the early 20th century with the rise of Darwin, and in some sense that, that humans are animals like every other, and that there's no inherent meaning to our existence, that we grow up, we eat, we defecate, we have sex, we procreate, we reproduce, and then we die just like other animals. And that's what we call nihilism. Nihilism is this awareness that the world doesn't have any inherent meaning, that the world is meaningless. Now, it's not meaningless in the sense that we create meaning from it. That's what humans do. We tell stories about the world. And we traditionally had a story that we told in the West, which was we were created by God, and God told us to go and be prosperous and multiply. And then when people stopped believing that story, we then had a vacuum, a God-sized hole in Western culture that we needed to fill. And so it's been filled by this new apocalyptic religion. And should it surprise us that, they have come to treat, nature as a kind of God, and that we've had a sense of guilt, and the guilt is now, we now feel guilty for what we've done to nature. And of course, there's a group of people that gain power in telling the story. We see Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg gain power in telling the story. They use fear in the same way that old school preachers used fear to get people to control people and to gain power in society. And it's all happening, of course, under the backdrop of rising depression, rising alienation, rising loneliness. And so it meets some needs, but I do think it is not ultimately very satisfying. I think that nuclear provides a way out. And I think that pro human environmentalism is itself a counter spirituality to this nihilistic, anti civilization, depressing story. And that story is that it's not the same as the Judeo Christian story where we're sort of told by God, but it is a story of human progress. It's a story of human ingenuity. I mean, there is something truly magic about fission. I think that's partly what you were getting at. I mean, Maddie and Mark and I, when Maddie and Mark write Environmental Progress, I would think a lot about uranium as the sort of physical source or fuel for the fission reactions. I mean, fission, of course, is possible with any atom, but it's most possible with an unstable atom like uranium. And we became obsessed with these cloud chamber videos of, you might seen, where you put a piece
Yes,
of
yeah.
uranium in a cloud chamber, and then you can see the electrons flying off of it. And I thought this was very moving. And I also, it was around the same time I became obsessed with Marie Curie and the discovery of radium, the discovery of radiation, that there was some sense in which it's alive. I mean, it's not really alive. It's not a biological entity, obviously, but there's energy, and
It's
you kind of
yeah.
get down to it, and you kind of go. So much of the fear of death manifests as a fear of becoming, and that we know that what's really going on around us is that things are constantly in a state of change and becoming, and that we're constantly kind of trying to freeze things as they are. We have a lot of anxiety sometimes, a lot of existential anxiety around change. At one point, one of the Yimbys in San Francisco said the reason that baby boomers don't like to see change to their neighborhoods is because they fear death. I think there's something true about that, that there's something, we kind of want to go back to the windmills, back into the womb of pre-modern societies, to escape from all this horrible complexity, all this rapid change. And I think that nuclear is demanding an evolution of consciousness. It's demanding that we rise to the spiritual challenge of living in an age of nihilism. And we say it has meaning. And the meaning is that our destiny is to lift everybody out of poverty, reduce our environmental impact to such an extent that we can have vibrant wildlife, we can have vibrant ecosystems, we can have everybody in the world living without air pollution, water pollution, having abundance. That is a spiritual vision at bottom, I believe. That's not just a kind of scientific vision. That's not just science doesn't tell us what to do. Morals and ethics and spirituality does. And so nuclear needs to be part of that exciting, beautiful, life affirming vision against the anti civilization nihilism of our opponents.
Michael, have you watched that yogurt commercial, the solar punk yogurt commercial with it's got blimps in the sky or that are kind of windmills and solar panels and this huge, spacious, like
No.
Amory Lovins type house. It was making the rounds a while ago. It's got a few million views, but it is a kind of aesthetic that's being proposed, and it's quite attractive. It's like woman of
Yes.
color in a house, or kids are coming back on the flying school bus powered by I'm not sure exactly what. There's robots picking the apples, but it's a nice robot. And I mean, I
Right.
think so much of this the struggle of this movement is articulating. I mean, you're sort of putting it in, I guess, kind of philosophical, religious terms, but like articulating that aesthetics, right? And that's something, Maddie was up visiting Bruce Power the other day and articulating that as well. Just, that this is a big change for environmentalists to see this huge machinery, the scale of it, et cetera. But then situated in nature with minimal impact and, the scale of the power being produced, et cetera. But what do you think in terms of that? I talk a lot about a battle of ideas, but the kind of battle of aesthetics. Where do you see that going in the future? Yeah.
I mean, I'm so. First of all, let me also say something about. I do think that. First of all, I appreciate the recognition from you, Chris, because it's much appreciated, and I love that I'm the nuclear OG, and but I'm so. I can't tell you how happy I was to see you in the Wall Street Journal. I can't tell you how happy I felt when I saw Maddie's tweet thread on nuclear waste go mega viral. I mean, like 30,000 retweets, which means 10 million people saw it. I'm so inspired by Mark Nelson and Paris Wines in building stand up for nuclear events around the world. I love Zion Lights and seeing Zion Lights flower. I see all of you guys as the leaders of this movement, as visionaries. You're all so different and you're bringing different things to it. But yeah, I mean, we spent a lot of time with Maddie and Mark talking about the archetypes here. I do think the big one that Maddie and I, certainly, I think Mark, maybe to a lesser extent, got excited about was that nuclear is a Cinderella story. Genuinely, Cinderella was the sister who was mistreated and called dirty by inferior siblings, and she was actually the special one. Yeah, so I see Maddie playing with this, archetype a lot. I mean, I think I'm also inspired by seeing people rejecting the idea that nuclear waste needs to be buried far underground. It's the silliest, it's such an obvious anthropological ritual of burial of the dead, and it itself needs to be buried. The waste should be treated like cheese. It's alive. It's future fuel for reactors. It needs to be kept at the site of production. The nuclear plants themselves are going to be immortal. This is Mark Nelson's language. So you can see this community that we, I think, have created. This now it's an ecosystem, but it's trying to work out a kind of language, a kind of architecture of a new mythology for nuclear, a new, I hate to say religion, but certainly a new philosophy, a new worldview, something that can be a counterweight to this dystopian, apocalyptic environmentalism. So, yeah, I do think the picture is important. I saw another picture, by the way, from conservative environmentalists where I agreed with like half of it. Like you kind of go, we agree with the clean air. We agree with the kids playing. I mean, the kids should not be just coming off the school bus and going around in the home. They should be going out and climbing the tree and falling down and being in situations of danger.
Right.
They should be free
Yeah.
range kids. I think there should be some gardening, but there should also be industrial agriculture.
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, there should be some diversity of landscapes, right? I don't think we want to make it a cookie cutter, but yeah. And they had instead of solar or wind in the background, you want nuclear plants in the background with whales breaching in front of them. So no, I do think we've got some work to do, right? If we're
Yeah.
having to riff off a yogurt ad, it seems like
Well,
there needs to be some work creating that.
and fundamentally, I think bringing it back to that pro-human element, right, and really featuring people at the forefront of the story. Because I mean, you look at a lot of the advanced, like who's doing the aesthetic work right now? It's the advanced nuclear companies, and they're all really kind of high tech imaginings, from Oklo's A-frames to the Rolls Royce. I'm not sure what exactly that is, but they're peopleless landscapes, right? They're futuristic, they're cold, they're kind of not like the yogurt commercial, put it that way. And as you're saying, the yogurt commercial is not perfect for what I necessarily aspire to, but there is a vision that's to be painted, and I think it really does center the people involved, and we do a real
Yeah.
disservice to those people. Unfortunately, those people aren't doing the greatest job at I guess at representing their own interests and getting out there. But I think that's kind of where
I think
this
that's
movement's coming into it.
I spent a bunch of time frustrated with the nuclear industry, and I regret that I spent so much time frustrated with it. I also saw it as an opportunity at the time, but I now view it as even more than that, which is that, yeah, the nuclear industry is absolutely terrible at communicating its technology. Great, so we'll do it. There's now plenty of people and plenty of non-industry money and non-industry actors and in a vacuum. I mean, it's like the classic thing where it's like people sitting around and complaining about art today. It's like, well, go out and make your own art, or complaining about journalism. Go make your own journalism. Go. Don't sit there and complain about it. So I do think the sky's the limit in terms of what's possible here. I think we have a strong philosophical foundation. There's a strong and growing movement that has the right ethos if it can keep the kind of snobbery out of the movement and the
Mhm.
sectarianism out of the movement. Then I think there's a bunch of stuff that needs to be filled out. Some of the, like you said, some of the imagery, some of the picture, some of the storytelling, some of the archetypes. There's still some work to do, but I think this is a movement that has a real good foundation. I think a sufficient foundation now to go and save nuclear plants around the world, get nuclear plants built, and frankly lead the industry. That's needs to happen now.
So I guess just in closing, what's next? What's making you hopeful? I guess you're probably looking to Germany and seeing. Sounds like there's going to be some kind of a compromise there. Maybe they'll kill one of the plants to sacrifice one of those on the altar of the Green Party,
I
and
saw
preserve the
that.
two in the south. I mean,
That's
yeah, I
insane.
mean, but just give us, I guess, give us a little, a hopeful ending, and where you think
Yeah,
nuclear advocates should be putting their energies.
yeah. Well, like I said, I think that you guys are inspirations to me. So I think people that are listening should, be entrepreneurial, start your own thing, but also work with you and Mark and Maddie and Paris and Zion to really build an inclusive, inspiring movement. For sure. I mean, let's just step up all of this activity. Korea is really exciting right now. You saw the government of Korea said we're going to actually cut the funding for renewables. So we're going to increase the funding for nuclear. It was spot on. Japan is now pursuing more nuclear. We've seen a wobble in France where the president said, "Oh, the age of abundance is over." It's bonkers. I just gave a long interview to a French magazine that he reads criticizing him for that.
Nice.
So we got to do more in France. So everywhere in the world needs
There's
pro
such a
nuclear
passivity and
advocacy.
like an ethos of giving up, which drives me crazy. I mean, and then there's like the ultra, like it just in terms of the other psychological profiles, like amongst the kind of renewer bros, like the thin skinnedness is abs and like complete intolerance of critique. I mean, it's interesting the different sort of psychological frames that exist, right? And there'll always be those differences. We just did an episode with Mark on storage, and I just wanted to touch on the renewables thing with you. I guess in closing, there's so much I want to chat with you about, but you've been a real sort of thought leader in daring to criticize them. But we did the storage episode, Mark and I sort of opened it up by talking about fuels as storage, and we're sort of seeing the climate hawk renewables fantasies playing out with a shortage of fossil fuels, and it's proving that their experiment is not viable. Are you mentioned South Korea where they're sort of turning down funding for renewables and increasing for nuclear. Do you think that leaders around the world are learning the lessons from these examples in terms of your theory of change? You think that's going to happen quickly, slowly? I mean, there's a lot of ego on the line. Do kind of people just need to physically die off before new ideas can take over here?
I mean, look, it's going pretty well, man. I mean, I have to say, there were some dark moments and real fears and concerns, but this energy crisis arrived sooner than we thought because, of course, it was happening already in the fall of last year, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine accelerated it. So, no, look, I think we're at the very beginning of a nuclear renaissance that is going to last for a longer time than the last one did. I do think we're going to see. That means we have our work cut out for us. I mean, I always point out this is lifetimes worth of work. It's not like something that you're going to do. Nuclear is so hard, and it's got so much work to do that it's going to be lifetimes worth of work. It's not like we're going to get a law passed and suddenly we have equal rights for nuclear or something like that. It's really every single plant requires its own justification, its own movement, and great. You can see the incredible victory. I mean, Diablo was like the top news story, in California yesterday, maybe one of the biggest stories in the country yesterday. Big story around the world. Every time a nuclear plant is saved, it's an inspiration to everybody else in the world. So I just think we got the wind at our backs. I think we should take a minute and enjoy it. Take a Friday night and celebrate it. Clink some champagne or some non-alcoholic beverage of your choice, and then on Monday, let's get back to work because we got tons of work to do.
All right. Well, what a great place to leave it, Michael. Thanks for coming on. Great context. I learned a lot about some of the origin stories and about Diablo Canyon. Such a symbolic victory, a shot heard around the world. I think, as you were saying. Thanks for making the time, Michael. Looking forward to having you back soon.
Pleasure talking with you, brother. See you, Chris.